On the night of July 4th, 1804, in Charleston, South Carolina, 11 white men died in what authorities would later describe as the most systematic act of Negro vengeance in the history of the American South. Their bodies were found throughout the city, some hanging from the same oak trees where they had lynched interracial couples 2 weeks prior. Others discovered in their homes with throats cut, one dragged through the streets by his own horse, another drowned in Charleston harbor with his mouth stuffed with a wedding band. Each death was meticulously planned, brutally executed, and laden with symbolic justice that made even hardened slave patrollers hesitate before pursuing the perpetrator. The killer was Josiah Brown, a 33-year-old free black man, a skilled blacksmith, and a friend to the 3 black men who had been murdered alongside their white wives for the crime of love across the color line. This is the story of how one night of righteous fury shook the foundations of a society built on racial oppression, how a man transformed grief into systematic vengeance, and how the celebration of American independence became forever tainted with the blood of those who denied independence to others. But to understand that night of retribution, we must first understand the world that created it. Charleston, in 1804, was a city of brutal contradictions. Founded in 1670, it had grown into one of the wealthiest cities in North America, its prosperity built entirely on the Atlantic slave trade and the labor of enslaved Africans who outnumbered white residents nearly 2 to 1. By 1804, Charleston Harbor was the largest slave trading port in North America, processing thousands of captured Africans annually. The city's elite lived in opulent townhouses along the Battery, drinking French wine and wearing English fashion, while enslaved people built their fortunes in rice fields and indigo plantations surrounding the city. Yet Charleston also contained a small but growing population of free black residents, approximately 1,000 souls in 1804, comprising skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers who had purchased their freedom or been manumitted by masters. These free blacks occupied a precarious position in Charleston society. Legally free but socially subordinate, they were required to carry freedom papers at all times, faced strict curfews, could not testify against whites in court, and lived under constant suspicion from both enslaved people who resented their freedom and white citizens who feared their example. South Carolina law in 1804 strictly prohibited any marriage between white and black individuals under penalty of imprisonment, enormous fines, and in some cases re-enslavement of the black partner. The law extended beyond marriage to criminalize any unnatural and inordinate copulation between the races, language intentionally vague enough to prosecute consensual relationships as criminal acts. These anti-miscegenation laws served a clear purpose: maintaining the racial caste system that justified slavery and white supremacy. If love could cross the color line, if families could be built between races, if children could be born from genuine affection rather than rape and coercion, then the entire ideological foundation of racial slavery collapsed. The system required absolute separation, required that love between races be impossible or criminal, required that any white woman who chose a black partner be seen as depraved, and any black man who loved a white woman be seen as dangerous. Into this world was born Josiah Brown in 1771 on a small tobacco plantation in the Virginia Tidewater region, the son of an enslaved woman named Ruth and a father he never knew, likely the white overseer who had raped his mother. Josiah grew up enslaved, working the tobacco fields from age 5, watching his mother suffer under the dual oppression of slavery and sexual violation, learning early that the world was cruel and unjust, and that survival required silence and observation. When Josiah was 12 years old in 1783, his master decided to lease him to a local blacksmith to learn a trade that would increase his value. This decision, intended purely for the master's profit, became Josiah's salvation. The blacksmith, an elderly German immigrant named Hans Müller, who harbored quiet abolitionist sympathies, taught Josiah not just the craft of metalworking, but also how to read and write in secret, crimes punishable by severe whipping in Virginia. Müller would draw letters in ash on the forge floor, teaching Josiah the alphabet between hammer strikes, giving him a gift that could never be taken away: literacy, knowledge, power. By the time Josiah reached 21 years old in 1792, he had become an exceptional blacksmith, skilled in everything from horseshoes to decorative ironwork to weapon repair. His master, recognizing the profit potential, began hiring Josiah out to other plantations and to clients in Richmond, allowing Josiah to keep a tiny percentage of his earnings. 3 pennies of every dollar he generated. It was slavery with a veneer of meritocracy, a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing false hope of eventual freedom. But Josiah took that hope seriously. For 6 years, from 1792 to 1798, he worked every possible hour, saved every possible penny, denied himself every possible comfort, accumulating the enormous sum of $350, the price his master had set for his freedom. In March of 1798, at age 27, Josiah Brown purchased his own flesh and blood, received manumission papers signed and sealed, and walked away from the plantation that had stolen his childhood. He walked south, moving through Virginia into North Carolina and eventually into South Carolina, drawn by reports of Charleston's growing free black community and its demand for skilled craftsmen. Josiah arrived in Charleston in the spring of 1799, a free black man of 28 years, with remarkable metalworking skills, literacy unusual for his race, and $3 remaining in his pocket after the long journey south. He found work quickly at a blacksmith shop on Elliott Street, owned by a white craftsman named Thomas Barrett, who, while no abolitionist, recognized quality work when he saw it and paid Josiah fair wages for his labor. Within 2 years, Josiah had saved enough to rent his own small shop on Minority Street in the heart of Charleston's free black neighborhood, establishing himself as an independent craftsman, serving both white and black clients. His reputation grew steadily. He crafted beautiful ironwork, gates, railings, fireplace tools, alongside practical items like horseshoes, tools, and wagon repairs. White clients appreciated his skill and reliability. Black clients appreciated his fair prices and respectful treatment. By 1804, Josiah Brown owned his own shop, employed 2 apprentices, both free black youths learning the trade, and had accumulated nearly $100 in savings, a remarkable achievement for a man born in slavery. But Josiah's life in Charleston extended beyond work. He became an active member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Calhoun Street, one of the few institutions where free blacks could gather without white supervision. It was at this church in the summer of 1801 that Josiah met 3 men who would become his closest friends and whose deaths would transform him from peaceful craftsman into vengeful executioner. William Freeman was 30 years old in 1801. A skilled carpenter who had purchased his freedom 5 years prior and now operated a woodworking shop on Cumming Street. William was quiet and contemplative, a man who spoke little but worked with his hands to create beauty. Carved furniture, coffins for the free black community, decorative panels for white homes. He had been born enslaved on a rice plantation in Georgetown District, had watched his father die in the fields from heat stroke when William was 9, had endured 21 years of brutal labor before accumulating the funds to buy his freedom. William attended church every Sunday without fail, sang spirituals in a rich baritone voice, and dreamed of someday owning property and passing genuine freedom to children he hoped to father. Samuel Turner was 28 years old in 1801, a teacher who operated a secret school for free black children in the back room of a cobbler's shop on Beaufort Street. Teaching enslaved people to read was criminal in South Carolina, But teaching free black children existed in a legal grey area that Samuel exploited carefully. He had been born free in Philadelphia, the son of freed parents who had escaped slavery in Maryland and established a new life in Pennsylvania. Samuel had received education unusual for any black person in early America, attending a Quaker school that accepted students of all races. But in 1800, after his father died and his mother remarried, Samuel had felt called to move south, to bring education to black people trapped in states where literacy was denied systematically. He came to Charleston with nothing but books and hope, finding work as a tutor for wealthy white families while secretly operating his school for black children. Samuel was brilliant, articulate, passionate about education as liberation, and convinced that knowledge was the ultimate weapon against oppression. Thomas Grant was 35 years old in 1801, a sailor and ship's carpenter who worked Charleston Harbor, fixing vessels, loading cargo, and occasionally sailing on merchant ships traveling the Atlantic coast. Thomas had been born enslaved in Barbados, had worked sugar plantations under conditions that made American slavery seem almost merciful by comparison, and had escaped at age 19 by stowing away on a merchant vessel bound for Charleston. He had arrived in 1785 with nothing, had spent 15 years working the docks and ships of Charleston Harbor, and had somehow avoided recapture despite lacking proper freedom papers for years. Eventually, a sympathetic Quaker ship captain had helped Thomas obtain forged manumission papers, giving him legal freedom to match his lived freedom. Thomas was strong, weathered by sun and salt, with hands scarred from rope and tools. He had a booming laugh, told stories of Caribbean islands and Atlantic storms, and possessed a fierce loyalty to anyone he considered friend. These three men, William the carpenter, Samuel the teacher, Thomas the sailor, became Josiah's closest companions in Charleston. They met regularly at church, gathered for meals in their small homes, shared news of their businesses and dreams for their futures. They formed what they jokingly called the Free Men's Club, a support network in a city where being free and black meant constant vulnerability. They loaned each other money during slow seasons, protected each other from harassment by slave patrols, and provided the kind of brotherhood that slavery tried to destroy, but freedom allowed to rebuild. And in the year 1803, each of these three men fell in love with white women, women who, against all social convention and legal prohibition, loved them back. William Freeman met Margaret O'Brien in the spring of 1803 when she commissioned him to build furniture for the small house she had just purchased on Trad Street. Margaret was 26 years old, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Charleston 2 years prior, fleeing famine and English oppression in Ireland. She worked as a seamstress, operated her own small dress shop, and had saved enough to purchase a tiny house in a working-class neighborhood. Margaret had red hair, green eyes, freckles across her nose, and a fierce independence that Irish poverty had forged into steel. When she met William to discuss furniture specifications, she was immediately struck by his gentle demeanor, his careful attention to her ideas, and the beautiful work his hands created. William found himself equally drawn to this small, fiery woman who spoke to him as an equal, who looked at him with genuine interest, rather than the fear or contempt he typically received from white people. Over 3 months of furniture construction, conversations lengthened. Margaret would bring tea to William's workshop. William would stay after finishing work to talk about Ireland and Barbados, and dreams of freedom that transcended geography. By summer, friendship had become something deeper. By autumn, they were meeting secretly, walking at night in isolated areas, falling in love despite knowing the deadly consequences if discovered. Samuel Turner met Catherine Meyer in the summer of 1803 at a Quaker meeting house on Archdale Street. Catherine was 30 years old, a Quaker abolitionist who had moved to Charleston from Philadelphia with the explicit purpose of supporting the Underground Railroad and providing education to free black children. She had inherited a small income from her father's textile business, enough to live modestly and dedicate herself to abolition work. Catherine had been raised with Quaker beliefs in equality and the inner light present in all humans, regardless of race. When she met Samuel at a clandestine gathering discussing the establishment of more schools for black children, she was immediately impressed by his intellect, his passion for education, and his sophisticated understanding of philosophy and theology. Samuel found himself captivated by this plainly dressed white woman who quoted Frederick Douglass before Douglass had even published his narrative, who argued fervently for immediate abolition, and who treated him with a respect he had never experienced from white society. They began working together on the secret school, meeting regularly to discuss curriculum and pedagogy. Intellectual partnership became emotional connection. By autumn they were in love, meeting in secret, writing letters hidden in hollowed books, planning a future they knew society would never permit. Thomas Grant met Rebecca Whitmore in the autumn of 1803 at Charleston Harbor, where she volunteered at a Methodist mission providing aid to sailors and dock workers. Rebecca was 28 years old, the daughter of a Methodist minister who had died when she was young, leaving her with a small inheritance and a powerful commitment to serving the poor and marginalized. She had never married despite family pressure, preferring independence and mission work to the subordinate role of wife. When Thomas arrived at the mission one day seeking treatment for a rope burn on his hand, Rebecca tended his wound with capable hands and kind words. Thomas, accustomed to white people treating him as either invisible or threatening, found himself disarmed by this white woman who looked directly at him, asked about his life at sea, and listened genuinely to his stories. Rebecca found Thomas fascinating, his tales of Caribbean islands, his deep knowledge of navigation and weather, his booming laugh that made her smile despite the serious nature of her mission work. They began meeting regularly, Thomas volunteering at the mission during his time ashore, Rebecca finding excuses to be there when he arrived. By winter, friendship had transformed into love. They met secretly at the docks after dark, Rebecca hiding her red hair under a shawl, Thomas alert for any sign of slave patrols or suspicious whites. They knew the danger. They loved anyway. By early 1804, all three couples had made the extraordinary decision to marry. Not legal marriage, which South Carolina law forbade absolutely, but religious marriage, ceremonies conducted by sympathetic ministers in secret locations, creating bonds recognized by God, if not by the state. William and Margaret planned their ceremony for June 20th, 1804, to be held in the basement of an abandoned warehouse on Minority Street at midnight. Samuel and Catherine planned theirs for the same night at a safe house operated by Quakers on Meeting Street. Thomas and Rebecca planned theirs for the same night in a small boat anchored in Charleston Harbor under stars, with a Methodist minister who agreed to perform the ceremony despite its illegality. The three couples had not coordinated their timing deliberately. June 20th simply emerged as the first date when all the ministers, witnesses, and safe locations aligned. Josiah Brown was invited to all three ceremonies as honored witness, the closest friend these three men had, the brother they had chosen in freedom after slavery had stolen their blood families. But someone talked, whether through carelessness or betrayal. Word of the three planned interracial weddings reached the ears of the most dangerous men in Charleston, a gang of white supremacists who called themselves the Guardians of Racial Purity. This organization, numbering approximately 30 members drawn from middle-class tradesmen, shopkeepers and artisans, had formed in 1802 with the explicit purpose of enforcing racial separation through violence and intimidation. They were not wealthy plantation owners who benefited economically from slavery. They were working-class whites whose only social advantage over black people was their whiteness itself, and they defended that advantage with murderous ferocity. The Guardians had already committed numerous acts of violence against free blacks in Charleston: beatings, destruction of property, arson of black-owned businesses. They operated with impunity because authorities either sympathized with their goals or feared confronting an armed mob. The leader of the Guardians was a man named Nathaniel Grayson, a 42-year-old butcher who owned a meat shop on King Street. Nathaniel was tall and heavy, with a red face perpetually flushed from alcohol consumption, small eyes that radiated cruelty, and massive hands scarred from years of slaughtering animals. He had been born poor white in rural South Carolina, had inherited nothing but debts from his father, and had clawed his way to modest prosperity through brutal work and ruthless business practices. Nathaniel hated black people with a visceral intensity that exceeded rational explanation. He believed that racial mixing represented the greatest threat to white civilization, that any white woman who consorted with a black man was a traitor to her race deserving of death, and that black men who dared to love white women were committing a crime worse than murder. When Nathaniel learned of the 3 planned interracial weddings on June 20th, he called an emergency meeting of the Guardians and proposed what he called a night of necessary violence. The 11 men who would eventually die at Josiah Brown's hands, gathered at Nathaniel Grayson's butcher shop on the night of June 19th, 1804, to plan their attack. Besides Nathaniel, the group included Marcus Whitfield, a 38-year-old cooper who made barrels and casks, a man with thinning blonde hair and a permanent sneer; Jacob Thornton, a 40-year-old carpenter who competed with William Freeman for business and resented losing clients to a damn Negro; Edmund Crawford, a 35-year-old tavern keeper who served cheap whiskey and cheaper opinions on racial superiority; Richard Pemberton, a 45-year-old horse trader known for dishonesty and violence; Samuel Blackwood, a 32-year-old apprentice butcher who worked for Nathaniel and idolized his master's racism; Henry Caldwell, a 39-year-old sailor and dock supervisor who resented Thomas Grant's competence and popularity; Peter Rawlings, a 41-year-old shopkeeper who sold dry goods and spread gossip; William Ashton, a 37-year-old blacksmith who competed with Josiah Brown and hated losing business to free Negroes; Thomas Mitchell, a 43-year-old chandler who made candles and soap; and George Patterson, a 34-year-old constable who was supposed to enforce the law but instead used his position to harass and extort black residents. These 11 men drank whiskey, sharpened knives, prepared clubs and rope, and planned their attack with the casualness of men organizing a hunting expedition. They knew the locations of all 3 weddings, information extracted through intimidation from a terrified free black servant who had overheard planning conversations. They would strike simultaneously at midnight, bursting into all 3 ceremonies with overwhelming force. The plan was simple and brutal. Capture all 6 people, 3 black men and 3 white women, drag them into the streets, and execute them publicly as a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing the color line. The white women would be hanged as traitors. The black men would be hanged, but only after being beaten, castrated, and mutilated to ensure maximum terror. The Guardians would document the executions, spreading word throughout Charleston's free black community. This is what happens when you forget your place. Midnight of June 20th, 1804. William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien stood in the basement of an abandoned warehouse on Minority Street, hands clasped, facing a minister who spoke quiet words of union. Josiah Brown stood as witness, alongside 2 other free black friends. Candles provided the only light. The ceremony had just reached the exchange of vows when the door exploded inward. 8 white men poured into the basement: Nathaniel Grayson, Marcus Whitfield, Jacob Thornton, Edmund Crawford, Richard Pemberton, Samuel Blackwood, Peter Rawlings, and William Ashton. They carried clubs and rope. They were drunk and furious. William tried to shield Margaret, but clubs smashed into his ribs, his back, his head. He fell, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Margaret screamed, tried to fight, was backhanded across the face by Nathaniel Grayson's massive fist. She collapsed, dazed. The minister tried to intervene and received a club to the stomach that doubled him over, gasping. Josiah rushed forward, but was grabbed by 3 men, held while a 4th punched him repeatedly in the stomach until he vomited. The 2 other witnesses fled up the stairs, running into the night, too terrified to help. Within 2 minutes, William and Margaret were bound with rope, dragged up the stairs and pulled into the street. The guardians chanted, "Race traitor!" and "Nigger lover," as they hauled their victims toward the nearest oak tree. Simultaneously, at the Quaker safe house on Meeting Street, Samuel Turner and Catherine Meyer were exchanging vows when 3 white men, Henry Caldwell, Thomas Mitchell, and George Patterson, broke through the back door. The Quaker hosts tried to bar their way, but were shoved aside brutally, the elderly Quaker man's arm breaking when he was thrown against a wall. Samuel and Catherine tried to flee, but were caught in the small room. Samuel received a knife slash across his chest that opened his shirt and skin. Catherine was grabbed by her hair, yanked backward, and slapped repeatedly while Henry Caldwell called her whore and race traitor. But within minutes they too were bound and dragged into the street, blood marking their path. At Charleston Harbor, Thomas Grant and Rebecca Whitmore were being married by a Methodist minister on a small boat anchored 50 yards offshore when they saw lanterns approaching across the water. 2 rowboats carrying armed white men were coming fast, the remaining guardians who had split off to attack the 3rd wedding. Thomas immediately understood. He told Rebecca and the minister to jump into the harbor and swim for shore while he tried to delay the attackers. But before anyone could move, the rowboats pulled alongside, and white men boarded the wedding boat. Thomas fought. He was strong from years of maritime labor, and he managed to knock one attacker into the harbor and break another's nose before being overwhelmed by numbers. They beat him with oars until his face was unrecognizable, then bound him. Rebecca tried to jump overboard, but was grabbed, struck unconscious with an oar handle, and pulled into one of the rowboats. The minister was left alone, traumatized but alive, to witness the boats rowing back to shore, carrying their captives. By 1 o'clock in the morning of June 21st, 1804, all 3 couples had been dragged to 3 different locations in Charleston, 3 large oak trees in 3 different public squares where crowds could gather. Word spread quickly through the night. White residents emerged from homes in nightclothes, drawn by the commotion and the promise of spectacle. Enslaved people watched from shadows, terrified, forced to witness what happened to those who challenged the racial order. Free black residents watched in horror, some trying to intervene, only to be beaten back by guardians and their supporters. The executions were designed as public theater, performances of white supremacy intended to reinforce racial hierarchy through ritualized violence. At the oak tree in Marion Square, William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien were forced to stand on a wagon beneath a rope. Nathaniel Grayson addressed the crowd that had gathered, perhaps 200 whites, some cheering, some silent but complicit. "This Negro forgot his place," Nathaniel shouted, pointing at William, whose face was swollen from beatings, blood crusting on his torn clothes. "This Irish whore betrayed her race," he continued, grabbing Margaret by her red hair and forcing her head back. "They thought they could marry, thought they could mix blood, thought they could defile God's natural order." The crowd roared approval. Nooses were placed around both necks. Nathaniel looked directly at William and said, "Any last words, boy?" William Freeman Carpenter, 33 years old, born enslaved and died free, looked at Margaret with love in his eyes and said, "I would do it again. I would choose you again. I'd die free." Then Nathaniel Grayson slapped the horses pulling the wagon. The wagon lurched forward. The nooses tightened. William and Margaret swung from the oak, their bodies convulsing, their hands tied behind their backs, their love declared criminal by law, but eternal in death. The crowd cheered. Some spit on the hanging bodies. Others just watched, silent witnesses to state-sanctioned murder masquerading as vigilante justice. At the oak tree in Washington Square, Samuel Turner and Catherine Meyer faced the same ritual. But before they could be hanged, the guardians decided Samuel needed additional punishment. 4 men held Samuel down, while Henry Caldwell, who carried a knife from his work at the docks, performed a crude castration in the street. Samuel screamed until his voice broke. Blood pooled beneath him. Catherine sobbed, trying to look away, but forced to watch by Edmund Crawford, who held her head in position. When the mutilation was complete, Both were placed on the wagon, nooses around their necks. Samuel Turner, teacher, 28 years old, educated in Philadelphia and murdered in Charleston, used his last words to quote scripture, "No greater love hath any man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Catherine Meyer, Quaker abolitionist, 30 years old, daughter of textile merchants and friend to the oppressed, simply said, "God forgive them." The wagon moved. They hung together, their bodies swaying in the night breeze, their crime being love. At the oak tree in Hampton Park, Thomas Grant and Rebecca Whitmore were already unconscious from their beatings when the nooses were placed around their necks. The guardians did not bother with speeches for these two. They simply hanged them unconscious, denying them even the dignity of final words. Thomas Grant, sailor, 35 years old, born in Barbados and died in Charleston, never woke before the rope broke his neck. Rebecca Whitmore, Methodist missionary, 28 years old, daughter of a minister and servant to the poor, died without knowing she was dying. Their bodies hung limply, their wedding ceremony interrupted permanently, their love declared illegal. By 3 o'clock in the morning of June 21st, all 6 bodies hung from 3 oak trees in 3 Charleston squares. The guardians stood guard beneath them, drunk and triumphant, ensuring no one cut the bodies down before daylight when the full population could see them. White Charleston went back to sleep, satisfied that order had been maintained. Enslaved Charleston returned to quarters, terrified and traumatized. Free black Charleston stayed awake, grieving and enraged, but powerless to act. And Josiah Brown, who had been beaten and released as a witness meant to spread fear through the free black community, walked through the dark streets of Charleston with blood on his clothes and murder in his heart. Josiah visited all 3 hanging sites before dawn. He stood beneath each oak tree, looking up at the bodies of his friends, memorizing every detail of their deaths. William's crushed hands from pre-hanging torture, Samuel's blood-soaked pants from his mutilation, Thomas's face so beaten his features were unrecognizable, and their wives, Margaret with her red hair hanging limp, Catherine with her plain Quaker dress torn, Rebecca still wearing the simple wedding dress she had made herself. Josiah felt something break inside him, or perhaps something awaken. The careful, peaceful blacksmith who had survived slavery and built a free life through patience and hard work died in those hours before dawn. Someone else was born, someone cold, someone calculating, someone who understood that the law would never punish these murders, that society approved of these killings, that the only justice his friends would receive would be justice he delivered himself. Josiah returned to his shop on Minority Street as the sun rose on June 21st. He did not sleep. He sat at his workbench, took out paper and pen, and wrote 11 names: Nathaniel Grayson, Marcus Whitfield, Jacob Thornton, Edmund Crawford, Richard Pemberton, Samuel Blackwood, Henry Caldwell, Peter Rawlings, William Ashton, Thomas Mitchell, George Patterson. 11 men who had participated in the murders, 11 men who would die. Beside each name, Josiah wrote detailed notes about the man, where he lived, where he worked, his daily routines, his vulnerabilities, his families. Josiah had lived in Charleston for 5 years. He knew the city intimately. He knew these men because some had been customers, others he had seen around the city. Others were known to every free black person as dangerous. Over the next 2 weeks, Josiah would observe them carefully, finalizing his plans, preparing his weapons, waiting for the night when Charleston would pay attention to fireworks rather than screams. During those 2 weeks, Charleston authorities made no arrests for the 3 murders. The coroner ruled the deaths justifiable homicides in defense of public morality. The white newspapers praised the guardians for maintaining racial purity and warned that more such justice would be delivered to anyone else who violated the natural order. The guardians themselves celebrated openly, drinking at Edmund Crawford's tavern, boasting of their actions, planning future raids on the free black community. They felt invincible. They were right to feel that way. The law would never touch them. But law was not the only form of justice. Josiah Brown spent those 2 weeks preparing methodically. From his blacksmith shop he forged new weapons, a razor-sharp machete, several knives of various sizes, metal rope with hooks attached, and something special, 11 iron spikes, each engraved with the name of one of his friend's murderers. He sharpened these spikes until they could pierce bone. He collected rope, lots of rope, the same hemp rope used to hang his friends, purchased from different vendors to avoid suspicion. He visited Charleston Harbor at night, studying the tides and currents, identifying where a weighted body would sink versus where it might wash ashore. He walked the streets memorizing patrol patterns, understanding when constables passed through different neighborhoods. He stole a horse from a livery stable, keeping it hidden in an abandoned barn outside the city, knowing he would need mobility on the night of executions. And he prayed, not prayers for forgiveness or mercy, prayers for strength, prayers for steadiness of hand, prayers that he would complete his mission before being stopped. And on July 3rd, Josiah Brown attended the funerals of his 3 friends. The bodies had finally been cut down and released to the free black community for burial. The women were buried separately at a Quaker cemetery that accepted them despite the scandal. William Freeman, Samuel Turner, and Thomas Grant were buried side by side at the African Methodist Episcopal Church Cemetery, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses. At the burial, Josiah spoke the only words he would speak publicly about the murders. They died free. They died loved. They died right. We will remember. That night, Josiah returned to his shop and finalized his plans. July 4th was tomorrow. Independence Day, the perfect night. July 4th, 1804 began with celebrations throughout Charleston. The city marked 28 years of American independence with parades, speeches, military displays, and preparations for evening fireworks. White Charleston, dressed in their finest clothes, attended ceremonies praising American liberty while enslaved people served food and drinks, the irony lost on no one except those celebrating. The 11 men who had murdered Josiah's friends participated fully in Independence Day festivities. Nathaniel Grayson closed his butcher shop early to attend ceremonies at Marion Square. Marcus Whitfield joined fellow craftsmen at a parade. Jacob Thornton worked briefly in his carpenter shop, then departed for celebrations. Edmund Crawford opened his tavern early to serve patriots. Richard Pemberton conducted horse trading at the market. Samuel Blackwood helped his master Nathaniel with preparations. Henry Caldwell supervised harbor operations briefly before joining celebrations. Peter Rawlings closed his shop and joined the crowds. William Ashton, Josiah's competitor, worked his blacksmith shop for morning customers, then left. Thomas Mitchell delivered candles to various locations preparing for evening events. George Patterson, the constable, was on duty but distracted by festivities. By 6 o'clock in the evening, all 11 men were scattered across Charleston, most of them drinking heavily, all of them celebrating independence they had never truly earned. Josiah Brown spent July 4th preparing his weapons, loading his stolen horse, and reviewing his plans one final time. He had identified 11 locations where he would find his 11 targets throughout the night. He had planned 11 methods of execution, each chosen for poetic justice related to the specific man's role in the murders or his character. He had accepted that he might be caught before completing his mission, but he was determined to kill as many as possible before that happened. As sunset approached and Charleston began setting up for fireworks displays, Josiah, dressed entirely in black, strapped weapons to his body, loaded his saddlebags with rope and tools, and mounted his horse. He rode to the edge of the city, waiting in shadows for full darkness. At 8 o'clock in the evening, as the first fireworks exploded over Charleston Harbor, Josiah Brown began his night of vengeance. Target 1. Nathaniel Grayson, leader of the Guardians, butcher, the man who had personally hanged William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien. Nathaniel was at Marion Square, watching fireworks with his wife and 3 children, when Josiah approached from behind, silently, using the crowd and noise as cover. Josiah had 2 options: kill Nathaniel in the crowd and create immediate chaos, or isolate him first. He chose isolation. Josiah moved close to Nathaniel's eldest son, a boy of 12, and whispered, "Your father needs you at the shop. Emergency with meat spoiling. He sent me to fetch you." The boy, recognizing Josiah as a known blacksmith in the city, believed him and ran to tell his father. Nathaniel, annoyed at the interruption of his evening, but concerned about losing valuable inventory, told his wife he would return shortly and followed his son toward his butcher shop 3 blocks away. Josiah followed at a distance. When Nathaniel and his son reached the shop, Nathaniel sent the boy back to the square while he entered to check on the supposed emergency. The moment the boy disappeared around a corner, Josiah entered the shop behind Nathaniel. Nathaniel turned, saw Josiah, and initially showed no fear, just irritation. "What do you want, boy? My son said there was an emergency." Josiah closed and barred the door. Nathaniel's expression changed as he realized he was locked in his own shop with a free black man who was not showing proper deference. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Open that door." Josiah pulled out a machete. Nathaniel's eyes widened. "You're one of them friends, ain't you? One of them niggers that stood witness at the wedding." Josiah nodded slowly. "William Freeman was my brother, not by blood, but by choice. You hanged him for loving a woman who loved him back." Nathaniel's fear transformed into rage. "He broke the law. She broke the law. They got what they deserved." Nathaniel grabbed a meat cleaver from his workbench, raising it threateningly. "You think you can kill me? You're a dead man, boy. Dead man." Josiah did not respond with words. He responded with violence so sudden and brutal that Nathaniel had no time to defend himself. Josiah swung the machete horizontally, aiming for Nathaniel's weapon hand. The blade cut through wrist bone, severing Nathaniel's right hand completely. The cleaver and hand fell to the floor together. Nathaniel screamed, staring at the stump of his wrist, pumping blood. Josiah kicked Nathaniel's legs out from under him, dropping the large man hard onto his back. Nathaniel tried to crawl toward the door, leaving a blood trail, still screaming. Josiah pulled out rope, the same hemp rope used to hang William and Margaret, and bound Nathaniel's legs together, then bound the stump of his wrist to slow the bleeding. He did not want Nathaniel to die yet. Josiah dragged Nathaniel across the floor to a large meat hook hanging from the ceiling, the kind used to suspend pig carcasses for butchering. He lifted Nathaniel's massive body with effort, hooking the rope around Nathaniel's bound legs and hauling him upward using a pulley system until Nathaniel hung upside down, suspended 3 feet off the ground, his head near the floor, his severed wrist dripping blood. Nathaniel screamed continuously, but the fireworks outside drowned out every sound. Josiah stood before Nathaniel, looking into the terrified eyes of the man who had led the murders of his friends. "You made them suffer," Josiah said quietly. "You displayed them for entertainment. You called it justice. Now you feel fear. Now you understand." Josiah picked up one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Nathaniel Grayson. He showed it to Nathaniel so the butcher could read his own name on the instrument of his death. "For William," Josiah said. Then he drove the spike through Nathaniel's throat, piercing straight through windpipe and arteries and spinal cord, pinning Nathaniel's head to the floor. Nathaniel's body convulsed violently, legs kicking against the rope, but the spike held him in place. Blood pooled around his head. His eyes remained open, staring at nothing, as his life drained away in less than 2 minutes. Josiah waited until the body stopped moving, then cut the rope, letting Nathaniel's corpse collapse completely. He took the severed hand and placed it in Nathaniel's still-open mouth. Poetic justice, the hand that had placed nooses on innocent necks, now silenced in death. Josiah exited through the back door, melting into the crowds watching fireworks, just another black man in the darkness of Independence Day. 1 target down, 10 to go. Target 2. Marcus Whitfield, Cooper, the man who had kicked William Freeman repeatedly while William lay helpless on the ground. Marcus was drinking at Edmund Crawford's tavern on Queen Street with 5 other guardians: Edmund himself, Richard Pemberton, Samuel Blackwood, William Ashton, and Thomas Mitchell. Josiah observed from across the street. 6 men together was too many to attack directly. He needed to isolate Marcus. Josiah waited patient, watching the tavern. Fireworks continued exploding overhead. Crowds moved through streets, drunk and celebrating. After 90 minutes, around 10 o'clock, Marcus stumbled out of the tavern alone, headed toward the public outhouse behind the building. Drunk, distracted, vulnerable. Josiah followed. The outhouse was a simple wooden structure in a dark alley, reeking and isolated. Marcus entered, closed the door, and began relieving himself. Josiah approached silently, barred the door from outside with a wooden plank, trapping Marcus inside. Marcus noticed immediately, pushing against the door. "Hey! Who's out there? This ain't funny!" Josiah did not speak. He pulled out a rope with metal hooks attached to the end, a design of his own creation, and began wrapping it around the entire outhouse structure, binding the door closed completely. Marcus realized something was wrong. He pounded on the door, shouting, but the noise from fireworks and celebrations drowned him out. "Let me out! Let me out, you son of a bitch!" Josiah finished securing the outhouse, then pulled out a small flask of kerosene he had brought for this purpose. He poured it carefully around the base of the wooden structure, then pulled out flint and steel. Marcus smelled the kerosene. His shouting turned to screaming. "Fire! Fire! Please! Let me out! I'll give you money! Please!" Josiah struck the flint. Sparks caught the kerosene. Flames raced around the base of the outhouse, then began climbing the dry wooden walls. The structure was poorly built, full of gaps and cracks that allowed airflow, perfect conditions for rapid burning. Marcus's screams intensified as smoke filled the small space. He threw his weight against the door, but Josiah's rope and hooks held firm. The walls began to burn through. Marcus could be heard coughing violently, choking on smoke. His screams turned to desperate pleas. "God, please, help me!" Who? But God did not help. The fire consumed the outhouse completely, the walls collapsing inward. Marcus Whitfield burned alive, trapped in an outhouse, dying in the same filth he had embodied in life. When the structure had fully collapsed and the screaming had stopped, Josiah used a stick to push one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Marcus Whitfield, into the smoking ruins near where the body lay. Then he walked away, joining crowds running toward the fire, just another concerned citizen responding to an accident. 2 down, 9 to go. The fire at the outhouse drew attention from the nearby tavern. Edmund Crawford and the other guardians ran out to investigate, finding only smoking ruins and eventually the charred body of Marcus Whitfield. They assumed accident, drunk man smoking a pipe in an outhouse, tragic but not uncommon. They would not discover the truth until later. Josiah watched their reactions from the crowd, noting how they quickly returned to the tavern to continue drinking, Marcus's death barely slowing their celebration. It confirmed what Josiah already knew. These men had no loyalty, no true brotherhood, just shared hatred. Good. That made isolating them easier. Target 3. Jacob Thornton, carpenter, the man who had beaten Margaret O'Brien while calling her Irish whore. Jacob had left the tavern shortly after Marcus's death, walking unsteadily toward his home on King Street. Josiah followed at a distance. Jacob lived alone above his carpenter shop, a confirmed bachelor at 40 years old who spent his money on alcohol and prostitutes. As Jacob fumbled with his keys at the front door, Josiah approached from behind and struck him hard across the back of the head with a wooden club. Jacob collapsed forward, unconscious but alive. Josiah dragged him into the carpenter shop, then up the stairs to Jacob's living quarters. He laid Jacob on the man's own bed, then began tying him down with rope, binding arms and legs to the bed frame. Jacob regained consciousness slowly, his vision blurry, his head pounding. He tried to move and realized he was restrained. What? Who? His vision cleared. He saw Josiah standing at the foot of the bed. Recognition dawned. Fear followed. "You! You're that nigger! From the wedding!" Josiah placed a gag in Jacob's mouth, silencing him. Then he went to Jacob's carpenter tools, the same tools Jacob used to build furniture, coffins, and cabinets. Josiah selected several: a handsaw, a chisel, a hammer, a plane. He laid them out on a table next to the bed where Jacob could see them. "You build things with your hands," Josiah said quietly. "You're skilled, talented even, but you used those same hands to beat an innocent woman. Used your strength to destroy rather than create." Josiah picked up the handsaw. Jacob's eyes went wide, muffled screaming behind the gag. "Margaret O'Brien wanted to marry William. That was her crime. Love, and you beat her for it." Josiah began sawing through Jacob's right hand at the wrist. The saw was sharp, but sawing through bone takes time. Jacob thrashed against his restraints, screaming into his gag, but the ropes held. It took 3 minutes of sawing to sever the hand completely. Blood soaked the bed. Jacob passed out from pain twice, but Josiah slapped him awake each time, forcing him to experience it. When the right hand was severed, Josiah held it up so Jacob could see it. One hand gone, just like the hands that worked those tools. Then Josiah picked up the saw again. Jacob tried to plead through his gag, shaking his head desperately, but Josiah ignored him. He sawed through the left hand. Another 3 minutes of agony. Jacob's screaming was continuous but muffled. When both hands were severed, Josiah used hot coals from Jacob's fireplace to cauterize the stumps, preventing Jacob from bleeding to death too quickly. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Jacob was conscious but in shock, his mind broken by pain. Josiah took one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Jacob Thornton, and drove it through Jacob's heart, pinning him to his own bed. Jacob's eyes stared at the ceiling, wide and empty. His mouth still gagged, his severed hands placed on his chest like a grotesque funeral arrangement. Josiah left through the back stairs, emerging into the street where fireworks still exploded overhead and crowds still celebrated. 3 down, 8 to go. By 11 o'clock, the Independence Day celebrations were reaching their peak. The largest fireworks display was scheduled for midnight. Charleston was drunk, distracted, and utterly unaware that a methodical killer was moving through the city. Josiah's next 3 targets were still together at Edmund Crawford's tavern, but they were beginning to disperse. Target 4, Richard Pemberton, horse trader, the man who had dragged Margaret O'Brien by her hair through the streets. Richard left the tavern around 11:15, heading toward the stables where he kept his horses. He needed to check on a particularly valuable stallion he planned to sell in the morning. Josiah followed to the stables, a large building on the edge of the city. Richard entered through the main doors, lighting a lantern, walking down the center aisle between stalls. Horses shifted and snorted at his presence. Richard reached the stall of his prize stallion, a massive black animal worth over $200. As Richard opened the stall door to check on the horse, Josiah emerged from shadows and struck Richard across the back with a wooden beam, dropping him to the stable floor. Richard groaned, dazed. Josiah grabbed him by the hair, the same way Richard had grabbed Margaret, and dragged him to an empty stall at the far end of the stable. Richard regained his senses to find himself face down in dirty straw, his hands bound behind his back. He tried to yell, but Josiah stuffed a rag into his mouth, gagging him effectively. "You traded horses," Josiah said, crouching next to Richard. "Bought and sold them like property, just like you treated human beings, as property to be traded." Josiah hauled Richard upright and tied him to a vertical post in the center of the stall, binding him tightly so he could not move. Then Josiah went to the stalls and began opening doors, releasing 6 horses, including Richard's prize stallion. The horses, sensing freedom, began moving toward the open stable doors, but Josiah blocked their path, driving them back toward the stall where Richard was bound. Horses are not naturally aggressive toward humans, but they can be frightened into violence. Josiah pulled out fireworks, small firecrackers he had purchased earlier, and began setting them off behind the horses, creating explosions that terrified the animals. The horses panicked, rearing, kicking, trying to flee. Josiah herded them toward Richard's stall, then set off more fireworks directly behind them. The horses stampeded into the stall. Richard's muffled screaming could barely be heard over the thunder of hooves. The horses trampled him repeatedly, their hooves crushing his chest, his skull, his limbs. It took less than 2 minutes. When the horses finally calmed and dispersed, Richard Pemberton was an unrecognizable mass of broken bones and pulverized flesh, still tied to the post, his face destroyed beyond identification. Josiah drove one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Richard Pemberton, into the wooden post above the body. Then he released all the horses into the night, creating chaos as valuable animals ran through Charleston streets. 4 down, 7 to go. Target 5. Samuel Blackwood, apprentice butcher, the youngest of the guardians at 32, the man who had held Catherine Meyer down while others stripped and beat her before hanging. Samuel had left the tavern around 11:30, walking home to the small room he rented above a cobbler's shop. Josiah followed him through the darkened streets. As Samuel climbed the exterior stairs to his room, Josiah struck him from behind, a knife thrust between ribs that punctured a lung. Samuel gasped, collapsed on the stairs, clutching at the wound. Blood bubbled from his mouth. Josiah grabbed him and dragged him up the remaining stairs, leaving a blood trail. Samuel's room was small and sparsely furnished, a bed, a table, a chair. Josiah laid Samuel on the bed. The young man was dying, drowning slowly in his own blood, but it would take time. Josiah sat in the chair and watched. "You were the youngest," Josiah said. "You could have chosen differently, could have said no, could have walked away, but you participated. You held her down while she was beaten. You watched her hang. You celebrated." Samuel tried to speak, but could only cough blood. His eyes held terror and regret. Whether he regretted his actions or simply regretted being caught, Josiah neither knew nor cared. "You die slowly," Josiah said. "You die drowning in your own blood, just like Samuel Turner drowned in his own blood when you castrated him." Josiah waited for 40 minutes as Samuel Blackwood suffocated slowly, his lung filled with blood, his breathing becoming shallower and more desperate until finally stopping. When Samuel was dead, Josiah took one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Samuel Blackwood, and drove it into Samuel's forehead, pinning his head to the bed. Then Josiah left, closing the door behind him. 5 down, 6 to go. It was now past midnight. July 4th had become July 5th. The major fireworks displays were concluded, but celebrations continued throughout Charleston. Josiah had killed 5 men in 4 hours without detection. But he was aware that eventually someone would discover one of the bodies, that alarm would be raised, that his window of opportunity was closing. He needed to accelerate. Target 6. Henry Caldwell, sailor and dock supervisor, the man who had castrated Samuel Turner with his dockworker's knife. Henry had left the tavern around midnight, heading toward Charleston Harbor, where he maintained a small office in a warehouse. He needed to review shipping manifests for vessels arriving in the morning. Josiah knew Henry's route and was waiting in an alley near the warehouse. As Henry passed, Josiah stepped out behind him and looped a rope around Henry's neck, a garrote pulling tight. Henry struggled violently, his hands clawing at the rope, but he could not break free or cry out. Within 2 minutes, Henry collapsed unconscious, but not dead. Josiah had controlled the pressure carefully. Josiah dragged Henry's body to the edge of a dock, bound his hands and feet, then attached a heavy anchor to the ropes. Henry began to regain consciousness as Josiah prepared to roll him into the harbor. Henry's eyes opened, saw Josiah, saw the water, understood. Josiah crouched next to him. "You cut Samuel Turner, mutilated him in the street, made Catherine watch. Now you drown, just like so many enslaved people who chose the ocean over slavery." Josiah shoved Henry off the dock. The anchor pulled him down immediately. Henry tried to hold his breath, but the cold water and weight and bindings made it impossible. He opened his mouth to scream, and water rushed in. Henry Caldwell drowned in Charleston Harbor, his body sinking to the bottom, an anchor ensuring he would never surface. Josiah threw one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Henry Caldwell, into the harbor above where Henry had sunk. 6 down, 5 to go. Target 7. Peter Rawlings, shopkeeper, the man who had spread gossip about the upcoming interracial weddings, who had informed the Guardians. Peter had walked home from the tavern around 12:30, his shop and home located on Meeting Street. Josiah broke into Peter's shop through a back window, moving silently through the dark store. He climbed the stairs to Peter's living quarters above the shop. Peter was asleep in bed, drunk, snoring. Josiah stood over him, considering method. Peter had not directly participated in the physical violence of the hangings, but his information had made the attacks possible. He was complicit, culpable, guilty. Josiah stuffed a rag into Peter's mouth, waking him and gagging him simultaneously. Peter's eyes opened in terror. Josiah tied Peter's hands behind his back, then hauled him out of bed and downstairs into the shop. Peter sold dry goods, flour, sugar, cloth, tools, anything customers needed. Josiah found a large burlap sack used for storing grain. He forced Peter into the sack, feet first, pulling it up over Peter's body until only his head was visible. Peter was hyperventilating through his nose, terrified, helpless. Josiah sewed the top of the sack closed around Peter's neck, using heavy thread and a large needle. Then he dragged the sack outside to the street and rolled it into a large puddle of muddy water left from earlier rain. The puddle was only 4 inches deep, but it was enough. Josiah held the sack down, holding Peter's head under the water. Peter thrashed violently but could not escape the sack. It took 5 minutes for the thrashing to stop. Peter Rawlings drowned in 4 inches of street water, bound in a sack like unwanted trash. When Peter was dead, Josiah carved the name Peter Rawlings into the wet sack with a knife, leaving the body in the street. 7 down, 4 to go. Target 8, William Ashton, blacksmith, Josiah's competitor, the man who had beaten Josiah personally at the warehouse, the man who resented Josiah's success. William lived and worked in a building very similar to Josiah's own shop, ground floor workshop, upstairs living quarters. Josiah arrived around 1:30 in the morning. William was asleep upstairs. Josiah entered the ground floor workshop silently. He knew this space intimately. The layout was nearly identical to his own. Josiah went to William's forge, which still contained hot coals from the day's work. He added fresh coal and worked the bellows, building the fire to maximum heat. Then he went upstairs. William was sleeping deeply, drunk from Independence Day celebrations. Josiah tied William's hands and feet while he slept, then gagged him. William woke as Josiah finished the bindings, his eyes confused, then terrified. Josiah dragged William downstairs to the workshop, the bound man thrashing but unable to escape. "You and I do the same work," Josiah said, positioning William next to the now blazing forge. "We both shape metal, both create with fire and hammer, but you hated me for being free, hated me for being skilled, hated me for being black and successful." Josiah took a branding iron from William's own tools, heating it in the forge until it glowed red. William's muffled screaming intensified as he understood what was coming. "Enslaved people are branded like cattle," Josiah said, "marked as property. You wanted me to return to that, to be property again. So you'll die marked like property." Josiah pressed the red-hot branding iron to William's face, holding it there for 5 seconds. The smell of burning flesh filled the workshop. William's screams were continuous behind the gag. Josiah branded him again and again, face, chest, back, arms. 7 brands total. William passed out from pain, but Josiah revived him with cold water each time, forcing him to experience every brand. When all 7 brands were complete, William was in shock, his body trembling, his mind broken. Josiah took one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked William Ashton, heated it in the forge until it glowed red, then drove the red-hot spike through William's heart, cauterizing as it killed. William Ashton died in his own workshop, branded and burned, killed by the same tools he had used to build his livelihood. 8 down, 3 to go. It was now past 2 o'clock in the morning. Charleston was quieting. Most celebrations had ended. Josiah knew discovery of the bodies would begin soon. He needed to finish. Target 9. Thomas Mitchell, Chandler, the man who had participated in the hanging of Thomas Grant and Rebecca Whitmore. Thomas lived in a small house near the city market. Josiah approached around 2:30, breaking in through a back window. Thomas was asleep with his wife beside him. Josiah needed to isolate Thomas without harming the wife. He waited until Thomas rose to use the chamber pot, a common occurrence for a man who had drunk heavily. As Thomas stood urinating in the pot, Josiah struck him across the head with a club, knocking him unconscious. The wife stirred but did not wake. Josiah dragged Thomas out of the house through the back door, moving quickly. He pulled Thomas to a nearby alley, bound his hands, gagged him. Thomas regained consciousness in the alley, confused and terrified. "You make candles," Josiah said, showing Thomas a candle he had brought from Thomas's own shop. "Light in darkness. But you brought only darkness to innocent people." Josiah had prepared for this execution specifically. He had brought a small pot of melted wax, kept warm in a covered container. Thomas's eyes widened as he saw it. Josiah tilted Thomas's head back and began pouring hot wax into his mouth and nose, drowning him in the very product he made. Thomas choked, gagged, thrashed, but the wax filled his airways, hardened, suffocated him. It took 10 minutes for Thomas Mitchell to die, his mouth and nose sealed with hardened wax, unable to breathe. When Thomas was dead, Josiah pressed one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked Thomas Mitchell, into the still soft wax covering Thomas's mouth. 9 down, 2 to go. Target 10, George Patterson, constable, the man who was supposed to enforce law, but instead used his authority to harass and enable violence against free blacks. George was the most dangerous target because he was armed and trained. Josiah found him around 3 o'clock in the morning, finishing his patrol shift, walking toward the constable station on Broad Street. Josiah followed at a distance. As George turned down a narrow alley shortcut, Josiah made his move. He threw a rope over George's head from behind, pulling tight a garrote. George immediately reached for his pistol, but Josiah had anticipated this. He kicked George's legs out from under him, dropping him to the ground while maintaining pressure on the rope. George tried to fire his pistol, but Josiah twisted his wrist, causing the shot to go wide, the sound echoing through the empty street. Josiah maintained the garrote pressure until George passed out, then quickly disarmed him. When George regained consciousness, he was bound hand and foot, his own rope used to tie him, his own pistol pointing at his face from Josiah's hand. "You swore an oath," Josiah said, "to enforce law, to protect. Instead, you enabled murder. You participated in lynching. You are the worst kind of criminal, one who wears authority while committing crimes." George tried to speak, but Josiah had gagged him effectively. "No last words for you. You don't deserve them." Josiah shot George Patterson in the head with George's own pistol, the sound echoing through Charleston's early morning silence. Then Josiah reloaded the pistol, fired it again into the air, and dropped it next to George's body, making it appear as if George had struggled with an attacker. He drove one of his engraved iron spikes, the one marked George Patterson, into the constable's chest. 10 down, 1 to go. The shot had awakened nearby residents. Josiah heard voices, saw lights appearing in windows. He ran, disappearing into the maze of Charleston streets before anyone emerged. But the gunshot had served another purpose. It had alerted the city that something was wrong. Very soon the bodies would be discovered. Josiah had perhaps an hour before the full horror was revealed and the city locked down completely. He needed to find his final target and finish this. Target 11. Edmund Crawford, tavern keeper. The man who had provided the location for the Guardians to plan their attacks, the man who had celebrated loudest after the hangings. Edmund was the last. Josiah returned to Edmund's tavern on Queen Street around 3:30 in the morning. The tavern was closed, chairs upturned on tables, Edmund presumably asleep in his rooms above. Josiah broke in through the back door. The tavern was dark and silent. Josiah climbed the stairs, his footsteps silent on wood. He reached Edmund's door, tested it, locked. Josiah picked the lock using blacksmith skills, opening the door slowly. Edmund was asleep in bed, alone, snoring. Josiah stood at the bedside, looking down at the final man, the final target, the final link in the chain of murders that had stolen his friends. Edmund Crawford, 40 years old, tavern keeper, white supremacist, murderer. Josiah could have killed him quickly, could have cut his throat, shot him, strangled him, but Edmund was special. Edmund had provided the gathering place. Edmund had celebrated most enthusiastically. Edmund deserved special attention. Josiah tied Edmund to his bed while he slept, binding all 4 limbs securely to the bed frame. Edmund woke slowly, confused, then terrified as he realized his situation. Josiah stood at the foot of the bed, holding his last engraved iron spike, the one marked Edmund Crawford. "All of them are dead," Josiah said quietly. "Nathaniel, Marcus, Jacob, Richard, Samuel, Henry, Peter, William, Thomas, George. All dead. You're the last." Edmund's eyes went wide. He tried to speak, but Josiah had gagged him. "You gave them a place to plan murder. You celebrated their crimes. You profited from their hatred. Now you pay the cost." Josiah pulled out a knife. "I could kill you quickly, but you don't deserve quick." Josiah began cutting. Not killing cuts, but painful cuts. Arms, legs, chest, face. Shallow cuts that bled but did not kill. Edmund screamed into his gag, thrashing against the bindings, but escape was impossible. Josiah cut him 100 times. 1 cut for every year since 1704. 1 cut for every year that slavery had existed in South Carolina. 1 cut for every year of suffering inflicted on black people. Edmund passed out multiple times from pain. Each time, Josiah revived him with cold water, forcing him to experience every cut. When all 100 cuts were complete, Edmund was a mass of bleeding wounds, his bed soaked with blood, his mind broken. Josiah leaned close to Edmund's face. "William Freeman, Margaret O'Brien, Samuel Turner, Catherine Meyer, Thomas Grant, Rebecca Whitmore, say their names." Josiah removed the gag. Edmund could barely speak, his voice a whisper. "Please, please." "Say their names," Josiah shouted. Edmund sobbed. "William, Margaret, Samuel, Catherine, Thomas, Rebecca." "Good," Josiah said. "You'll die knowing their names, knowing they mattered, knowing justice found you." Josiah took his last engraved iron spike and drove it through Edmund Crawford's throat, severing his windpipe and carotid artery. Blood fountained. Edmund's eyes stared at the ceiling. Within 2 minutes, he was dead. The last of the 11. The final execution. Justice completed. Josiah stood in Edmund's room, covered in blood, holding his machete, looking at the 11th body. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. He could hear voices outside, distant, but growing closer. The bodies were being discovered. The alarm was being raised. His time was ending. Josiah had known from the beginning that he would likely not survive this night. 11 murders in one night. The entire city would hunt him. There was no escape. But he had not planned to escape. He had planned to finish. And he had finished. Josiah walked downstairs, exited through the front door of the tavern, and stood in the middle of Queen Street. Dawn was approaching, the sky beginning to lighten. He could hear shouting now, multiple voices, people running. Someone had found Nathaniel Grayson. Someone had found Marcus Whitfield. The horror was being revealed. Within minutes, dozens of white Charleston residents appeared, carrying weapons, torches, some on horseback. They saw Josiah standing in the street, covered in blood, holding a machete, standing in front of Edmund Crawford's tavern. They surrounded him immediately, weapons pointed, shouting, "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground! Don't move!" Josiah did not drop his weapon. He looked at the crowd surrounding him and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "My name is Josiah Brown. I am a free man. I was born enslaved, but purchased my freedom. I am a blacksmith. I am a Christian. I'm a citizen of South Carolina. 2 weeks ago, 11 white men murdered 6 innocent people, 3 black men and 3 white women, whose only crime was love across the color line. William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien were hanged in Marion Square. Samuel Turner and Catherine Meyer were hanged in Washington Square. Thomas Grant and Rebecca Whitmore were hanged in Hampton Park. The authorities called it justified. The newspapers called it necessary. No one was arrested, no one was punished. So I delivered justice myself. Tonight, all 11 murderers are dead. I killed them. I alone. No one helped me. No one else is guilty. I am the only one, and I do not apologize. I do not repent. I would do it again. Because when the law denies justice, the oppressed must create their own. Remember this night. Remember what happens when you murder innocent people and call it righteousness. Remember that black people, enslaved or free, are human beings with dignity and agency and the capacity for vengeance. Remember William, remember Margaret, remember Samuel, remember Catherine, remember Thomas, remember Rebecca. Say their names. Never forget. Then Josiah Brown raised his machete and charged the crowd. He knew he would die. He wanted to die, but he would die fighting, die free, die having completed his mission. The crowd fired. 20 musket balls tore through Josiah's body simultaneously. He fell in the middle of Queen Street, his blood mixing with the dust, his machete falling from his hand. The crowd stood in shocked silence, staring at the dead man, the words he had spoken echoing in their minds. Josiah Brown died at 4:15 in the morning on July 5, 1804, in Charleston, South Carolina. He was 33 years old. He died free. He died having avenged his friends. He died having terrified an entire city. The aftermath of what became known as the Independence Day Massacre was swift and brutal. By noon of July 5th, all 11 bodies had been discovered, each death more horrific than the last. The city was in absolute panic. Enslaved people were locked in their quarters. Free black residents were rounded up and questioned, beaten, imprisoned without evidence. Josiah's body was mutilated by the mob, dragged through the streets, then hanged from an oak tree in Marion Square, the same tree where William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien had been hanged. Authorities declared martial law. The militia patrolled constantly. Any black person found outside without explicit permission was arrested or worse. The terror lasted for weeks. Charleston's white population was convinced that Josiah had been part of a larger conspiracy, that a black uprising was imminent, that they were all in danger. Of course, there was no conspiracy. Josiah had acted alone. But fear does not require facts. The 11 white men were buried with full honors. Their funerals were attended by hundreds. Ministers preached about martyrdom and white victimhood, carefully omitting any mention of why these men had been killed. Nathaniel Grayson was praised as a defender of Southern values. The others were eulogized as tragic victims of Negro savagery. The 6 people they had murdered, William, Margaret, Samuel, Catherine, Thomas, Rebecca, were not mentioned. Their names were erased from official accounts, but in the free black community, different stories were told, stories passed in whispers, preserved in secret, carried through generations, stories of Josiah Brown, the blacksmith who refused to accept injustice, stories of 6 innocent people who dared to love across the color line and paid with their lives. Stories of the night Charleston learned that oppression has consequences. Josiah's body was eventually taken down from the tree and buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field outside Charleston. No marker, no memorial. Authorities wanted his name forgotten, his act erased from history. But you cannot erase truth simply by refusing to speak it. The free black community remembered. Enslaved people remembered. Abolitionists in the North heard the story and publicized it, using Josiah's actions as evidence of slavery's inherent violence and injustice. Frederick Douglass, in a speech in 1847, referenced the Charleston blacksmith who delivered justice when the law refused, a veiled reference to Josiah Brown, whose story had reached Douglass through the whisper network of resistance. Harriet Tubman, in her old age, was reported to have mentioned the man who killed 11 devils in one night when discussing various acts of slave resistance. The story persisted. The story spread. The story mattered. We must ask difficult questions. Was Josiah Brown a hero or a murderer? Was his violence justified or criminal? Is revenge ever the same as justice? The answers depend entirely on perspective. To the white supremacists of Charleston in 1804, Josiah was a terrorist, a monster, a criminal who deserved death. To the enslaved and free black people of Charleston, Josiah was an avenger, a liberator, a man who stood up when no one else would. To abolitionists in the North, Josiah was proof that slavery's violence would inevitably generate resistance, that a system built on oppression could not expect submission forever. To historians, Josiah is a complicated figure whose actions reveal the moral impossibility of slavery itself, a system so unjust that it justified extreme violence in response. We cannot condone murder. We cannot celebrate bloodshed, but we also cannot ignore context. When the law provides no protection, when authorities enable murderers, when society celebrates lynching, when love itself is criminalized, what options remain for the oppressed? Submit and die slowly, resist and die quickly, or fight back and die free? Josiah chose the third option. He did not die a victim. He died a warrior. The legacy of that July night in 1804 rippled through Charleston and beyond for decades. The city instituted even harsher restrictions on free black residents, requiring them to have white guardians, limiting their movements further, increasing surveillance. But those restrictions also revealed fear. Charleston's white elite now lived with the knowledge that they were not invulnerable, that their victims could become their executioners, that oppression had costs that might someday come due. This fear influenced everything: harsher laws, more brutal enforcement, but also a quiet understanding that slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction. Some historians argue that events like Josiah Brown's revenge contributed to the growing sectional tensions that eventually sparked the Civil War. Each act of resistance, each demonstration that enslaved and free black people had agency and power, challenged the fundamental ideology that justified slavery. If black people could plan and execute complex vengeance, could read and write, could love and marry and fight, then the racist theory that they were naturally inferior collapsed. The system required believing black people were subhuman. Acts like Josiah's proved otherwise. In the end, we remember. We remember William Freeman and Margaret O'Brien, who wanted only to love each other. We remember Samuel Turner and Catherine Meyer, who believed in education and equality. We remember Thomas Grant and Rebecca Whitmore, who dreamed of a future without racial barriers. We remember the 11 men who murdered them and paid with their lives. And we remember Josiah Brown, the blacksmith who transformed grief into justice, tools into weapons, patience into fury. We remember because their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about American history. We remember because remembering is resistance. We remember because these stories, buried and erased by official histories, deserve to be told. And we remember because the questions their lives and deaths pose remain relevant. How do we achieve justice in unjust systems? When does violence become justifiable? What costs are acceptable in the fight for freedom? How do we honor those who resisted even when their methods trouble us? These are not historical questions. They are present questions. From slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration to police brutality, the legacy of racial oppression continues. The systems change names but persist, and resistance continues, taking different forms, using different methods, but animated by the same fundamental demand: justice, equality, dignity, freedom. July 4th. 1804 was supposed to be a celebration of American independence. Instead, it became a reminder that independence was never universal, that freedom was never free, that the nation's founding ideals, liberty, equality, justice, were denied to millions. Josiah Brown's violence was horrific. It was also the product of a horrific system. We should not celebrate violence, but we must understand it. We must recognize that when society builds its prosperity on oppression, when law protects murderers, when love itself is criminal, desperate people will seek desperate justice. Josiah Brown sought that justice. He found it at the end of a rope, covered in blood, having delivered vengeance that terrified a city. He died knowing his friends had been avenged. He died free, and that, perhaps, was his real victory. Not the 11 men he killed, but the fact that he chose his own death rather than accepting the death society had chosen for him. Enslaved people were denied agency, denied choice, denied control over their own lives and deaths. Josiah claimed that control. He decided when to act, and how to die. That agency, that choice, that freedom, even purchased at the cost of his own life, was a radical act of resistance in itself. The sun rose over Charleston on July 5, 1804, revealing a city changed forever. 11 men were dead. One man had delivered justice society refused to provide. The oak trees that had held the bodies of innocent lovers now held the body of their avenger. And somewhere in the whispers of the enslaved, in the quiet conversations of free blacks, in the coded songs and secret gatherings, a new story began to spread. The story of the blacksmith who would not submit, the story of revenge so complete it shook a city, the story of love so powerful that even death could not diminish it, the story of freedom claimed through violence when no other path remained. These stories persist because they matter, because they remind us that oppression always generates resistance, because they demonstrate that human dignity cannot be fully destroyed, only tested, because they prove that the oppressed are not passive victims, but active agents who will, eventually, demand justice by any means necessary. Remember Josiah Brown. Remember William, Margaret, Samuel, Catherine, Thomas, and Rebecca. Remember what they fought for and what they died for. Remember that the struggle for justice continues, that the battle against oppression never ends, that every generation must decide what it will tolerate and what it will resist. And remember that sometimes the only way to honor those who came before is to continue their fight, to refuse submission, to demand justice, and to never, ever forget. The Independence Day Massacre of 1804 is not taught in textbooks. The names of the victims and the avenger have been erased from official histories. But erasure is not the same as absence. These people lived. These events happened. This history is real, and by remembering, by telling these stories, by refusing to let them be forgotten, we resist that erasure. We give voice to the silenced. We honor the dead. We continue the fight. Say their names: William Freeman, Margaret O'Brien, Samuel Turner, Catherine Meyer, Thomas Grant, Rebecca Whitmore, Josiah Brown. Remember them. Remember what was done to them. Remember what they did in response. Remember, resist, and never accept the official lies that power tells to justify oppression. The fight continues. The memory persists. Justice, delayed but never denied, endures.